The Antarctic, the coldest, most desolate environment on Earth. Temperatures here can drop to 100 degrees below zero. Winds can reach 200 miles per hour. No other continent is as inhospitable. In 1900, apart from parts of its coast, it remained utterly unknown. But the turn of the 20th century was to see attention turn to this final land frontier. European nations began to launch expeditions to explore this mysterious southern land. It was a time when successful explorers could become national celebrities. And for a certain type of man, the challenge of exploration proved irresistible. One such man was Ernest Shackleton.
Antarctica is a huge landmass, 1.5 times the size of the United States of America. And 99% of this enormous landmass is covered by ice.
The lowest surface temperature recorded on the planet, minus 89.2 centigrade, was on Antarctica. So it is a decidedly uncomfortable climate. The weather, there's a hell of a lot of it, and it can change quickly.
Born on the 18th of February 1874, Ernest Henry Shackleton spent his early years in the tranquil surroundings of Ireland's County Kildare, before his Anglo-Irish family moved to England when he was 10. His father Henry, originally a farmer, set up as a doctor in Sydenham, south of London. As a schoolboy at nearby Dulwich College, young Ernest hardly seemed destined for greatness.
He seemed rather bored by formal education at this time. He certainly wasn't inspired by education at Dulwich College. He was certainly not a violent schoolboy, but we see him not afraid of the rough and tumble of school life in this period.
According to the early accounts of him by one of his sisters, he used to read a tremendous amount of romantic boys' literature. The Boy's Own Paper, very popular amongst the youth of that time. In fact, I think I can just about remember it myself. And it was full of exciting stories. I think this is the sort of thing that triggered the idea in Shackleton's mind as a young boy. He was a great reader of romance.
Ernest had already begun to feel the call of the sea, and after leaving Dulwich at the earliest possible opportunity, he joined the Merchant Navy. On the 19th of April 1890, he set off from Liverpool on his first voyage on the clipper Houghton Tower. He was 16.
The ship was a windjammer type, which took him on a fabulous voyage around Cape Horn and then up the Pacific coast of South America to Chile, where they had to unload and load up with various goods and take them all back to England again. It was a pretty routine trip.
He claimed in later life that he'd rounded Cape Horn for the first time in a blizzard and that he'd felt a call to the south. The Antarctic offered Shackleton a way out of the rigorous, monotonous life of the merchant seaman and an opportunity for advancement and fame.
He was soon to get the chance to follow his dream. The golden age of polar exploration was beginning. In the north, the legendary Fridtjof Nansen reached a record position of 86 degrees north in 1895. Pressure grew for a British expedition, and it fell to the president of the Royal Geographical Society, Sir Clemens Markham, to organise the National Antarctic Expedition. Its main aim, to reach the South Pole. To lead the team, Markham appointed a 32-year-old naval lieutenant who would become forever associated with the Antarctic. Robert Falcon Scott. When Ernest Shackleton heard of the plan, he seized the moment. Using his already formidable persuasive powers, he secured a place on the expedition. On the 6th of August 1901, they left for the south.
Yes, the journey from Britain to the Antarctic was a long and difficult sea voyage, but not particularly arduous by the standards of seafaring in those days. Remember, the ship was basically under sail. That was cheaper than coal, and you didn't have to worry about taking vast amounts of coal. But remember also that many of these ships were built for navigation in ice, so you don't do very well for a keel. Anything like that's likely to be knocked off or damaged when you're navigating through ice. So the phrase is sort of built like a bathtub and wallow like a pig.
After sailing into Antarctic waters on Discovery, the expedition established base at McMurdo Sound in the Ross Sea. After camping for the winter, the three men chosen to head for the South Pole set off on the 2nd of November 1902. Robert Scott, Dr. Edward Wilson and Ernest Shackleton with sledges and dogs. It was a nightmare journey.
Their equipment and organisation was inadequate to the task. The diet was inadequate. They were undoubtedly suffering from scurvy by the end of the expedition. Their clothing was inadequate, not up to combating the rigours of the Antarctic environment, the intense wind, the cold, the changes in temperature. Their use of polar transport was very poor. They had a team of 19 dogs and 5 sledges, but instead of dividing the dogs between the sledges, they simply harnessed the 5 sledges in a relay and left the 19 dogs to ride off at the front, and of course made very little progress. They were amateurs in Antarctic exploration, and it showed in the relative lack of progress they made towards the South Pole.
Profound differences in personality between Scott and Shackleton also came to the fore.
Here were two young, ambitious seamen, both drawn to the Antarctic through the opportunity for advancement and fame. And I think Scott felt threatened by the energy, enthusiasm and charm of this young naval seaman who was very popular. He got on people's nerves as well. And I think that when Shackleton became ill during the march south, Scott allowed the animosity that had developed towards Shackleton to come out, and he wasn't a good leader at that point. He had to be taken aside by Wilson and told to lay off Shackleton, as Scott had criticised him. Scott didn't help matters, of course, by calling Shackleton famously at one point, referring to him as a bloody fool. And Shackleton, of course, turned round and said, well, you're the biggest bloody fool of all of us. And Scott, with his strict naval discipline, found the expression of such sentiments as this almost mutinous.
On the 30th of December, having reached only 82 degrees south, Scott made the decision to halt and turn back while they still had a chance.
By now, the dogs were practically reduced to nothing because they were badly fed, underfed, and the conditions were not good, in fact very bad, and Shackleton began to show signs of physical distress. He started to cough blood. Also, he had a dicky heart, which he hadn't admitted to when he set out from London. In fact, I don't think he had a medical, if I remember rightly. So nobody knew about this dicky heart. Anyhow, what with one thing and another, it all ended up with his having to sit on the sledge for a while Scott and Wilson pulled the sledge along.
5 weeks of indescribable difficulty later, the three men reached base at McMurdo Sound, starving, exhausted and diseased, but alive.
At that time, a relief ship had arrived called the Morning. So Scott thought this was a good opportunity to send the invalids back. And with Shackleton having coughed blood and generally not seeming too good, Scott thought he'd better give him a medical, so he got Curtis, the doctor, to give him a medical, and suggested, or so it's thought, suggested to Curtis that he, if anything, on the negative side, and get Shackleton sent home. And that's what happened.
This may as well have been influenced by Scott's investment in mounting a Royal Naval expedition. And I don't think it helped Shackleton's cause the fact that he was a member of the Merchant Navy. And so Scott, in his eagerness to promote a Royal Naval Antarctic expedition, was not too upset to see a merchant seaman sent home. But that said, I think undoubtedly Shackleton was extremely ill.
Back in Britain, Shackleton decided not to return to the Merchant Navy, and instead tried his hand at a number of ventures, including a spell as a journalist, a period as head of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, and even politics, when he stood as a candidate in the 1906 election. But none of these activities appeared to wholly satisfy his Irish adventurous spirit. Even marriage to an old friend of his sister, Emily Dorman, in April 1904, and the birth of a son and daughter could not tame his desire to return to the Antarctic.
We see him drifting, trying his hand at different things, and the Antarctic offered Shackleton an opportunity for advancement, an opportunity for fame. Certainly as well there was the motivation that he had been tarred slightly with the brush of failure after being sent home early from Scott's first expedition, and he was eager to get back and prove himself in the arena of Antarctic exploration after the perceived slight of being sent home from Scott's first expedition.
Wanting to go back to the Antarctic, it's by no means a Shackleton thing. Many persons have done this and made quite a career in Arctic and Antarctic exploration. Now basically a man can't do everything, and those are two places where specialized knowledge, specialized techniques are very valuable. And from personal experience I can say they're truly fascinating and amazing places. They don't necessarily appeal to everyone, but in polar exploration there's plenty of recidivists. Shackleton was but one.
In February 1907, he announced that he had raised the funds to launch his own independent trek south, the British Antarctic Expedition. Again, the aim was the pole, and after setting sail on the 30th of July 1907 in a sealing ship, Nimrod, the British Antarctic Expedition reached McMurdo Sound at the end of January 1908. After a winter of experiments and preparations, Shackleton set off for the pole on the 29th of October 1908 with colleagues Jansen Boyd Adams, Frank Wild, and Dr. Eric Marshall, taking with them not dogs, but Manchurian ponies.
Both Scott and Shackleton's experience on the Discovery expedition had prejudiced them against the use of dogs in polar exploration. I think in many ways this was a result of their ignorance. They weren't experienced dog drivers and they had tremendous difficulty handling the dogs. So for Shackleton, dogs were merely more trouble than they were worth.
Ponies, some expeditions had tried them. They proved themselves reasonably useful in the Arctic, crossing sea ice in places in Franz Josef, but really with ascending crevasse glaciers, when they've got a hoof to try to get traction, they prove themselves really quite inefficient. Pony snowshoes were made. They helped to some extent, but not on the ice. Tragically, I suppose one could say, the greatest contribution the ponies made was by their meat for the dogs.
Initially, their progress was good, and within 4 weeks they had passed the furthest point south reached by the Scott expedition, and by Christmas Day they were just 250 miles from the pole. But now blizzards intervened, preventing any travel at all on some days. As 1909 began, Shackleton realized that their goal would remain out of reach. On the 9th of January, they planted the Union Jack and photographed themselves at the furthest south attained by man. By Shackleton's own calculations, They were just 97 miles from the pole.
Shackleton's decision to turn back when 97 miles from the South Pole has, I think, to stand as possibly the greatest decision in the history of polar exploration. I think if they'd gone on to the pole, and Shackleton himself was certainly driven, they would have died. They would have starved on the return journey.
The calculation on how much food they had, that they'd reach the pole but starve on the way back, was the essential part. And on the return journey, just before they got back to the base camp, they had bad weather and very close to did starve. Those were quite finely done calculations.
They may have failed to reach the pole, but their achievement in getting so close was undeniable. The British public certainly agreed. Overnight, Shackleton became a national hero. Feted by society on his return to England in June 1909, he became Sir Ernest Shackleton by the end of the year. Parliament voted him £20,000 to help clear the expedition's debts. Shackleton produced a best-selling book describing his Antarctic adventures, and he lectured to packed houses on the subject all over Europe. For one man, however, Sir Ernest's new celebrity was galling. That man was Robert Scott. Before Nimrod set sail in 1908, Scott had insisted to Shackleton that he make his Antarctic base away from McMurdo Sound. Scott was already planning his own next trip south, and he felt that, since it was his 1902 expedition that discovered McMurdo Sound, he had the right to be the next to use it. Shackleton reluctantly agreed, but, as we have seen, used the base anyway.
Shackleton certainly did not want to land and make Hut Point and McMurdo Sound his base camp. He did not want to break the promise that he had made to Scott that he would not use the old Discovery base camp on his expedition. But he was forced to change his mind by the ice conditions he encountered. He sailed along in the hope of finding a base camp on King Edward VII land, but unfortunately the Ross Ice Shelf had changed considerably in the few years since the departure of the Discovery in 1904, and the area of land which he had hoped to make his base camp on simply wasn't there anymore. He sailed around looking for an alternative base camp. He then thought that he should maybe return to McMurdo Sound. He didn't want to. He waited 48 hours, but eventually I think he was faced with little choice, either to camp at McMurdo Sound or to abandon the expedition. And he was also placed under considerable pressure by the captain of the ship, Captain England, who was very concerned with the safety of the ship and urged him strongly to go to McMurdo Sound and make his base camp at the old Discovery base camp.
But in those Edwardian days, the concept of a gentleman's word being his bond was still paramount. Scott and Shackleton would never meet privately again. When Scott's next attempt at his goal began in 1910, he felt confident the prize would be his. Scott's expedition is now, of course, the stuff of legend. He did indeed reach the pole in January 1912, only to find a black flag flying there, left by the team of Roald Amundsen, an experienced explorer. There can be few British folk unfamiliar with how the ailing Captain Lawrence Oates left his tent to die in the hope that it would save his colleagues. A hope that was, of course, forlorn. When the legend of Scott of the Antarctic began to form, Shackleton began to yearn for the South once more.
Many people who travel to the Antarctic talk of the spell that this wonderful natural environment casts over them. And they say that when they return home, they forget the hardships that were involved in living in the Antarctic and remember only the beauty, the sense of awe and wonder at nature's majesty that they felt in the Antarctic. Well, we should also remember another reason people explore is because it isn't here. The Antarctic offered Shackleton an escape from the monotony and the mundane reality of daily life. And I think if there is an obsession, it was an obsession to live again in this wonderful, majestic natural environment with its opportunities of adventure and excitement.
At the very end of 1913, Shackleton announced a new expedition to the Antarctic and immediately began preparations. His plan was daring. He intended to make a crossing of the Antarctic continent via the South Pole itself. On one ship, he would sail into the icy Weddell Sea to set up base at Wasel Bay. At the same time, another ship would enter the Ross Sea to berth at the familiar McMurdo Sound. A land party would then head towards the pole, laying depots of provisions. Shackleton would then march to the pole from Wasel Bay, taking dogs this time, before returning by the depot route to McMurdo Sound. By the summer of 1914, he had the men and the resources to depart, including the ships Aurora, which would carry the depot team, and Polaris, a 300-ton barkentine built for a Norwegian expedition that never took place. Shackleton renamed it Endurance, after his family motto, "By endurance I conquer." It was to be an appropriate name. By August 1914, Shackleton was ready to depart. But events far beyond his control now threatened the expedition. Europe was on the point of war.
I think if the war had broken out during the preparations for the expedition, there was a very good chance that Shackleton himself might have decided to put the expedition on hold and get involved in the war. But the fact that the preparations were so advanced that the Endurance was on the point of departure, indeed had departed by the time Britain actually entered the war, swung the balance towards the continuation of the expedition.
Endurance had sailed on the way to the Antarctic and the war began. Shackleton offered his ship, everybody aboard, and everything for the war effort if needed. And one of these excellent signals that he should proceed was received. At those days, at the beginning of the war, it was thought it would not last very long. 1914 to 18 was a lot longer, and they emerged from Elephant Island still finding it in full swing, if I can put it that way, and many men subsequently enlisted.
By November, Shackleton and the Endurance were docked at South Georgia, a desolate southern island inhabited only by the hardy whalers of the southern seas. They were now out of wireless contact with the world and its war. When they left the island on the 8th of December, they cut their ties with civilization completely and headed into the Weddell Sea on the first stage of their journey, where they would have to negotiate the perils of pack ice.
Pack ice is a particular problem on the frozen sea, Arctic and Antarctic. Seawater itself freezes at minus 1.8 centigrades, but as well as the ice, you actually get saltwater brine in it. And as distinct from freshwater ice, it's resilient, it's almost bouncy. You can hit it and bounce off. Trying to get your way through it with explosives won't work. Ordinary freshwater ice, as you know, on the surface of ponds is brittle. So you've got something that is strong and resilient, and you're trying to hit it and break through. A lot of energy doesn't get you very far. Now, as the winter develops, it gets thicker and thicker. The cold on the surface is freezing the sea beneath. That's all right if it's more or less flat and in level and an area with no currents and not much wind. But Endurance was in the Weddell Sea. Here you have the Weddell Sea gyre circulating. And at the northwest side, it all reaches the land and various islands and rafts up above itself. Sections of the ice rise above each other in the pressure, force over it, and 1 meter might become 2 meters or more thick. You'll find big ridges rising in this area, effectively the mills of ice.
Despite the ice, Endurance sailed on south throughout December. Christmas was celebrated merrily, and optimism was high. The day before Christmas, the second ship, Aurora, sailed south from Tasmania into the Ross Sea. The expedition was proceeding as planned. But early in the new year came the first signs of trouble. Endurance spent 5 days immobilized in the pack ice. By January the 10th, they were back on course, and the crew soon had their first sight of the Antarctic coast. Soon, they were within 60 miles of their destination. Then, on the 19th of January 1915, the ice closed around Endurance once more. This time, it would not release its grip.
I think the negotiation of pack ice is always a gamble. It's always risky. And I'm not sure there was much they could have done to avoid the Endurance being trapped in the ice. It was bad luck.
I think in that particularly difficult sea ice year with 1914 technology, there was nothing they could have done. There were ice saws, long metal blades which cut through the ice and would try to lead the ship out, or to make a clear area long enough for the ship to get up full speed and hit the ice at the end of it. These were all tried but were unsuccessful. And ferrying it, poling it, a system of sallying ship, where all the men are on the port and the order go to starboard and they're running backwards and forwards trying to move it and wriggle out of the ice. Virtually everything was tried. And with the ice in that exceptionally difficult year, I think we can say with hindsight, there was no hope.
Shackleton and his men could do nothing but wait on the ship. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear that the expedition was in real trouble. By the end of February, the feeble Antarctic summer had already passed, and Shackleton accepted the inevitable in his diary. The temperatures were very low both day and night, but as the pack was freezing solidly around the ship, I could no longer doubt that the Endurance was bound for the winter. The dark Antarctic midwinter would last until the end of July, and there would be no hope of escape before then. With their fate utterly unknown to a preoccupied outside world, Endurance continued its miserable drift north. The hope now was that the ice would soon release the Endurance. Instead, it was about to crush it.
The ship was basically twisted. Her planks were sprung, she was filling with water. The pressure remained. The ice in various places came through the hull. So you had a doomed ship, largely full of water, but still effectively, I will say, on the surface rather than afloat, because she was held up by the ice.
October the 27th, 1915, saw the fateful order given to abandon the Endurance. After retrieving as much as they could from the stricken vessel, including the precious lifeboats, the team of men made camp as best they could on the ice. Without a ship, in the middle of the sea, Shackleton informed the men of his intentions with inspirational simplicity. "So now, we'll go home," he announced. It was easier said than done.
They were in a desperate situation, and looking back, the situation looks almost hopeless. But Shackleton's gift was for inspiring leadership, for inspiring the men around him to believe in the goal that he had set. And this was essential to keep away the lack of spirit, the bad morale, which otherwise would have destroyed the expedition. It perhaps at that stage, what wasn't so important as the realisability of his plans was the fact that he had set a goal which could keep the crew motivated.
Shackleton first proposed marching over the ice to the land. With the ice drifting north, a march west would, he hoped, bring them to Graham Land on the Antarctic Peninsula. 3 days after abandoning Endurance, they began to move. Teams of dogs and men pulling what they could on sledges, including the lifeboats. It was a short journey. Marching and pulling in soft snow without skis, their progress was virtually nil. After 2 days, Shackleton called a halt.
When they started to try to move off across the ice to the next camp, taking the boats to get to the ice edge, they didn't get very far. Travelling conditions were far more severe than expected, and they had two methods of travel. On the ice, the boats were on the sledges. Later on, the sledges might have been on the boats as necessary. But with all the pressure ridges and the nature of the ice, this was extremely hard work. They didn't get very far before they set up the next camp and gave that trekking up as not worth the effort. And from there they were able to return to the ship. And remember, you've got quite a substantial shipwreck. Plenty of firewood from that.
Endurance finally sank on the 21st of November. For the next 4 months, Shackleton and his men remained on the drifting ice. For food, they killed seal and penguin whenever they could. That they were able to eat any fresh meat at least kept the dreaded scurvy at bay. For drinking water, they had the sea ice, which is naturally purged of salt. For washing, they had virtually nothing. They grew filthier by the day. Shackleton knew that, in their desperate situation, the needs of the mind were as important as the needs of the body.
He realised they were in a desperate situation, and he realised that one of his key roles as leader of the expedition was to keep morale high, to keep setting goals, to keep the men focused, to try and keep spirits up. Because if people became demoralised, discontent would spread, and it was likely that the expedition would then fail, and the consequences could have been disastrous.
Having drifted 1,000 miles north since Endurance was trapped, the ice was now, at last, beginning to break apart. On the 9th of April 1916, with the floes breaking up all around them, they took to the boats.
The situation was desperate when the crew set off in the 3 boats. There was still meat and seal meat, but this was getting very monotonous. A very desperate situation was faced. Morale was beginning to, must have been coming under pressure, and the prospect of spending the Antarctic winter on the ice would have been a terrible one to confront.
3 flimsy vessels on some of the toughest seas on the planet, powered only by oars and makeshift sail. It was to be a tortuous journey. The conditions were appalling.
Boils, the beginnings of frostbite. Many of the men suffered from dysentery, from eating uncooked dog meat pemmican, and they had to relieve themselves over the side of the boats. Hunger, terrible thirst. Shackleton himself is said to have gone 100 hours without sleeping during this boat journey. And Frank Wilde later wrote that he thought when they arrived at Elephant Island that half of the crew were insane.
7 days after launching, they arrived at Elephant Island, a barren outpost of rock and ice 20 miles long. With fresh water available at last, the men were almost delirious, as Shackleton noted. Some of the men were reeling about the beach, as if intoxicated. They were laughing uproariously, picking up stones and letting handfuls of pebbles trickle between their fingers like miners over hoarded gold. Despite their achievement, Shackleton knew their difficulties were far from over. Although there was fresh water to drink and birds and seals to eat, they had arrived at a place where no one would ever think of looking for them. Indeed, they were Elephant Island's first visitors for 86 years. They would have to go to sea again, and, because of the direction of the winds, their only chance was to head for South Georgia, the whaling island where they knew they would find relief. It was 800 miles away.
In the circumstances, it was the best chance of getting rescue, but it was hardly a good chance. The things in their favour, the wind and the currents go in the direction of South Georgia. Indeed, an enormous amount of wind and an enormous amount of current and sea conditions go that way. And the island is well placed. If you consider it a sort of new moon shape, they were aiming for it for the southwestern coast, which is, as far as the island goes, a reasonably large object. It's still difficult navigation, but anywhere on that coast is more attainable than, for instance, the South Sandwich Islands, South Shetland Islands, or other islands that don't present such a favourable aspect to the wind and currents.
Reckoning that it wasn't worth all the men risking the journey to South Georgia, a party of 6 was assembled. Shackleton himself, Worsley, Vincent the boatswain, Second Officer Tom Crean, Seaman Timothy McCarthy and McNeish. On the 24th of April, they put to sea once more, leaving behind the men whose survival now depended on them.
They'd done the best for preparing her. She was well ballasted with rocks, stones from the beach on Elephant Island, on which the men had to sleep, which was hardly comfortable. There were sleeping bags there. They slowly became sodden, of course. The decks, she was decked over with what materials they had and items from the other boats and covered with canvas. But she leaked. She was 8.23 meters long and going through some of the most tempestuous oceans on the planet.
By the 7th of May, they were within 100 miles of land. But Shackleton now had to make a decision on which the lives of all were to depend. Worsley's intention was to approach South Georgia's western side before heading across the northern coast to the whaling stations. With their position not entirely certain, however, Shackleton feared that the wind would carry them past the island's west and out into open ocean and certain doom. He insisted on a slight change of course to the east. It was a crucial decision. The next day, they arrived at the uninhabited southern coast of South Georgia, and with mighty seamanship in the teeth of a hurricane, the James Caird came to rest in a small cove at King Haakon Bay. It was the 10th of May, 1916. Shackleton's judgment had saved their lives. Exhausted, the 6 men took time to recover from their 17-day voyage, but all knew that they would somehow have to make contact with the whalers on the north of the island. By sea, it was a journey of 150 miles, and it was doubtful whether their boat would survive the trip. Instead, Shackleton decided to make the journey overland, over the utterly uncharted South Georgian interior.
I suppose, bearing in mind what we now know about the difficulty of crossing the island, he might have reconsidered. But his map of South Georgia was woefully inadequate. It was reasonable for the shores, but there were no contours or nothing indicating any situation in the chart of the fact that it had mountains approaching 3,000 meters in it. He had insufficient knowledge of. Mind you, he soon found out.
They moved the James Caird up to the end of King Haakon Bay and turned it upside down for shelter. McNeish, Vincent and McCarthy would stay there, while the other 3 would attempt to cross the mountains and glaciers of the island to find assistance. Profoundly ill-equipped for such a journey, they set off nonetheless in the early morning of the 19th of May. To save weight, they took no sleeping bags.
Having surmounted the boat journey from Elephant Island to South Georgia, I think they must have thought, we're so close now. We're so close to success, to saving our comrades, our companions left behind on the island, that it drove them through and on to make this journey that had never been made before across the mountains to the whaling station.
With the weather remarkably favourable, they pressed on hour after hour. But when they encountered the 5 pinnacles of the Trident mountain ridge, their progress slowed. Of the 4 passes through the ridge, The first led to a 2,000-foot precipice, and the second proved utterly inaccessible. When they looked over the third pass, they had to make a decision. With time running out, they decided to chance the slope on the other side, by toboggan.
I think they had no choice. They certainly couldn't have survived a night out on the mountainside in tattered clothes with no sleeping bags. And tired as they were, climbers will tell you that climbing down is the time that often mistakes are made when you're not concentrating as hard. Well, given the conditions that these men had endured over the last 2 weeks, they certainly were in no fit state to negotiate a very difficult descent. So in some ways we can see this mad toboggan ride as an act of impetuosity, but in another way it may have been a more sensible decision to say, yes, we just at this stage, a difficult descent would be even more of a danger, and we must now just throw caution to the wind and go for it.
They dropped 1,500 feet in 3 minutes before stopping. They were all safe, but they were still only halfway there. At 6:30 on the second morning, after just 5 minutes of rest, they found themselves on another ridge when they heard a noise. It sounded like a steam whistle. When they heard it again at 7, they knew. It was a whistle, summoning the men of the whaling station to their day's work. Overjoyed, they shook each other's hands. They had heard sound created by other men. Their determination was redoubled. Nothing would stop them now. Not even a 500-foot descent of fearsome blue ice, which they negotiated by cutting steps. After 18 months, 1,000 miles of drift in endurance, 1,000 miles adrift on the ice, the 3-boat journey to Elephant Island, the 800-mile trip to South Georgia, followed by the first ever crossing of the island, they came across their first external human company. 2 young boys. Soon, though, the 3 men located the station manager, Thoralf Sørle, and revealed their identities to the astonished Norwegian, who immediately set to providing for their needs. A steaming hot bath, a shave, clean clothes, and mountainous quantities of food were laid on. As they sat at dinner, the 3 explorers related their amazing tale. Grimly, they were also informed of the events of the Great War.
It's easy, given the drama of the journey, to ignore the tremendous sense of shock and disjuncture which news of the First World War must have brought Shackleton when he arrived at the whaling station. News of submarine warfare, of the use of poison gas, of war in the air. This was a world transformed by the greatest conflict that had yet been staged in human history.
I might add that when one is in the Antarctic, you might consider the isolation could cause things to become a little strange. But when you are living in the Antarctic and listening to the radio and the things the rest of the world does to itself, you wonder who's gone mad. I suspect they thought the world had gone mad then.
The 3 men at King Haakon Bay were quickly picked up by a transport ship from the whaling station. The Elephant Island group were also rescued, but only after 3 attempts to reach them were thwarted by ice.
I think the leadership that Shackleton showed in all of the 4 expeditions he was involved was significant. Endurance, of course, it was put to the hardest test. To keep everyone together with various problems, there was virtually mutiny on one occasion and difficulties of this nature, kept them together, remained on good terms with many, maintained a command, and got the party for which he was responsible all out alive and in very difficult circumstances, is a major tribute.
It was a source of genuine pride for him. He had proved himself a leader of men. By January 1922, Sir Ernest Shackleton was back in the south. He now had plans to circumnavigate the Antarctic continent. He simply couldn't stay away. This time, however, it was not to be. On the 7th of January 1922, back on South Georgia, he suffered a heart attack and died. He was 47. On the 5th of March 1922, Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton was buried on South Georgia, a location utterly fitting in death for the man who had survived so much in life.
I think everybody liked him. Everybody liked him. To have lived with him would have been quite impossible, of course, but he was a great man, Shackleton.
I think in normal circumstances, Shackleton was probably quite annoying, rather full of himself, always wanting to be the centre of attention. However, if you were in a tight spot, I don't think there's anyone you'd rather have had with you.
The polar region of Antarctica is one of the harshest and most unforgiving environments on Earth. It was into this trackless wilderness that Captain Robert Falcon Scott and his 4 companions ventured early in November 1911. They were determined to be the first men to reach the South Pole. They were never to be seen alive again.
For people who write letters and books now criticizing any of these polar explorers of 100 years ago, they are totally writing these things for the benefit of their apparent fact. It is in fact fiction, because hindsight is not something which is a genuine way of judging the abilities and the conceptions of the people at that time.
That Captain Scott is very much a legendary figure. Indeed, this institute's named after him. With the Discovery expedition and Terra Nova expedition, there were 2 major Antarctic expeditions with a huge contribution to mapping, geography generally, and science.
Scott has become part of the British myth of the explorer hero, I think, and I don't believe that it will ever be otherwise. But that is not to say that he has escaped criticism.
I find it really difficult to imagine what it must have been like for Scott and those other early Antarctic explorers. At the time, Antarctica was an unexplored and certainly unknown continent, and there were certainly no maps or no charts of the area. So, one wonders if Scott really knew what Antarctica was going to be like and what he was letting himself and his fellow team members in for, really.
I think that discussing the mistakes that Scott made is a futile argument. Who knows? Who's to say what decisions he made at what time that were right or wrong? Hindsight's a wonderful thing. We all think we could have done better. We all think that, I wouldn't have done that. He was stupid to do that. But it's impossible to second guess the situation he was in. It's not unlikely that the cold, the stress, malnutrition, whatever, things like that can have an amazing effect on your decision-making abilities. And I think it's quite unfair to try and second guess what he was thinking at a time when we have no idea how things were working out for them.
Robert Falcon Scott, the British Antarctic explorer, and his brave polar party finally arrived at the southernmost point on Earth, the South Pole, on the 17th of January 1912. For 78 days they had fought their way through unimaginable weather conditions, through driving blizzards and temperatures which had fallen as low as 40 degrees below freezing. Despite their heroic efforts, the hand of fate was to prove unkind to them. The black flag which greeted them at the pole had been placed there a month beforehand by a Norwegian team led by Roald Amundsen.
This particular black flag was the one that Amundsen left on the South Pole, a standard survey flag. The colour is of course black, as were all the survey flags used in the White Continent.
Just over a year later, the news of the British team's deaths reached London, and so the name of Robert Falcon Scott immediately passed into legend. There was little in his early life to mark him down for such greatness. Born on the 6th of June 1868, he was brought up in the comfortable surroundings of Oatlands, the family home in Devonport. His mother was a strong Victorian matriarch, and his father was a quiet man who suffered from the odd violent outbursts of temper.
According to the early biographers, it appears that he had a very happy childhood, and he played with his sisters in the garden of his father's house. Certainly when he was in the Navy, he felt very responsible for his mother. His father died and left his mother widowed, and she had a very small amount of money to live on and was largely supported by Scott himself.
By 1887, at the age of 19, Scott was fully immersed in a career in the Navy, training as a torpedo officer on the HMS Rover. In the same year, Scott came into contact with Sir Clemens Markham, who would irrevocably change the course of his life. Markham was a true Victorian gentleman who was obsessed by the idea of conquering the Antarctic region. He recognized the area as the ultimate challenge to man, with mystery and danger in equal measure. There was only one thing more important to Markham than getting a man to the pole, and that was that the man should be British.
Clement Markham knew that he wanted somebody of a certain age, and he went out, and whenever he was in society all over the place, he was looking out. And he once went to a boat race, a naval boat race between 3 young lieutenants, and the one that won was Scott, and he remembered that when he saw them many years later.
The two men did not meet until 1899, 13 years after Markham had spotted Scott's potential. Within 2 days, Scott had applied for the post of commander on the Antarctic expedition. If Scott needed fresh impetus and direction, the prospect of the Antarctic challenge must have seemed almost too good to be true. The Antarctic which Robert Falcon Scott was to come to know was recorded for posterity in these famous watercolors by his great friend and fellow explorer, Dr. Edward Wilson.
Diary is the one that Edward Wilson kept, and in it he includes some amazing sketches of the hut, the flag, and the Norwegian items actually at the South Pole. The method Wilson used for producing his magnificent watercolors was to do these sketches and paint them up in the hut. You couldn't do watercolors in the field. The stuff was very much a solid. But if you look at this one, for instance, again the Norwegian tent at the pole, you'll see that he's put little indications around the sketch of the flag, giving its colors, red, white and blue. Also bits on the texture, the red brown leather pieces, likewise on the tent, were sufficient for Wilson as an expert artist.
The Antarctic Wilson recorded is the most remote continent on Earth.
I find it impossible to try and imagine what it was like. Even the remotest field party today will have a radio that they can contact base, contact other field parties. The bases have got radios, satellite phones, email, fax, and all the other sort of modern communications. Compare that with Scott's day, and they had nothing other than what they could carry a message by hand or by mouth. They had to go from one person to another, even if the parties were separated by thousands of miles to pass a message. And getting a message out of the Antarctic meant waiting for the ship to leave at the end of the expedition, or maybe partway through the expedition. So I find it very difficult to actually imagine what it was like coping with the lack of communication.
If a man sets foot there, he is over 600 miles from the nearest land. Some 5.5 million square miles in size, it contains over 90% of the world's ice. Should the ice ever melt, sea levels would rise by 200 feet. Temperatures drop to almost unimaginably low levels, the lowest on record being minus 126 degrees Fahrenheit.
The coldest it got down to when I was there was minus 44 degrees Celsius, which felt really cold to me. I wouldn't wanted it to have got any colder than that, but it does, it certainly does. That was quite a warm year at the station I was at. It normally can get down to below minus 50. An average minus 30 degrees C. It feels the coldest when it's windy and it's, say, minus 20 degrees Celsius because the wind just cuts through. And
The atmosphere is so pure, so free from haze, that visibility can reach up to 200 or 300 miles. Any sense of scale, however, is completely distorted by the total lack of vegetation.
you don't go to Antarctica expecting it to be easy. There certainly are dangers, but because we know that, we take extra precautions. Particular danger is crevasses.
And crevasses are huge, massive holes in the ice, which are often covered by a very, very thin layer of snow. Now, if the weather conditions are the visibility is quite poor and there's a lot of snow blowing around, you can very easily fall into one of these crevasses.
They can be anything from a few centimetres wide to many tens of metres wide, and they can go down to depths of many tens or even many hundreds of metres in some cases.
And in fact, one of the Scott team fell into a crevasse on 2 occasions, and that's what eventually he died from his injuries. So that was the first member of the team to die, the Scott team.
Like a minefield in the army, you just got to go. And if you fall in, you hope that the rope which is tied between you and your sledge will be sufficient for you to fall into the hole, but the sledge not to fall after you. Or, if the sledge falls into the hole, for you not to be dragged after it. Now, very often people would find that the man and the sledge and the dogs would all fall into the same hole, and that would not only kill the man and the dogs, but would often, as in the case of Douglas Mawson back in 1914, all the food was on that sledge, and they were 300 miles away from anywhere in awful country. Theirs was the slow death of starvation.
So whenever we go walking in an unknown sort of area or unknown crevassed area, we always have a harness with a rope attached, and we tie ourselves together with somebody who walks 10 metres in front of us, who's also on the other end of that rope. The idea being if the person in front goes down the crevasse, they'll pull me to the ground, and I should have an ice axe so I can ram the ice axe in and hopefully stop them from falling too far down the crevasse.
You very rarely find one that's deeper than 180 feet. But you can die quite easily if you fall 180 feet, because there's very sharp bits of ice all the way down that you can get stuck on and smash your skull or your backbone. It's very easy then and now to kill yourself by falling into a crevasse. It is impossible then and now to know where the crevasses are before you've fallen into them.
The Antarctic can also be unbelievably beautiful, with refracted light causing false suns and moons. It was this unknown world of beauty and danger that Sir Clemens Markham hoped to claim for Britain. Expeditions had ventured into the hazardous region before, from Britain, Norway and Belgium. In 1897, the Belgian ship Belgica became trapped in the Antarctic's unyielding ice field for some 2 years. Aboard was a young Norwegian first mate who would later play a more notable role in Antarctic exploration, Roald Amundsen.
Roald Amundsen had been to the Antarctic before Captain Scott. He was aboard the Belgica, the first ship to winter in the south. Subsequently, he made an amazing journey through the Northwest Passage, did that successfully, the first vessel to transit it. And he was extremely keen on polar exploration. He'd done Arctic and Antarctic, and had very much the object of reaching the South Pole. The way this expedition was organized and arranged was most strange, though. Publicly, right until the last moments, it was put out as a North Polar expedition. It wasn't until he reached Madeira that he publicly announced that he was going to the South Pole.
By 1899, after years of hard work, Markham had managed to raise enough money to get the British project underway. Scott was acutely aware of his own lack of experience in polar conditions, and so arranged a visit to Oslo to speak to a man whose knowledge of the area was second to none, Fridtjof Nansen, the famous explorer who had developed an unrivaled expertise in dog sledging. "Take dogs to the pole," Nansen told Scott. "Train them well, and they'll not let you down."
The method of transport that had been recommended to Scott and had been used extensively in the Antarctic was sledge dogs. Nansen proposed that should be the transport they'd rely on greatly. Scott had a large number of sledge dogs in the first expedition, and indeed they were breeding. Second expedition, likewise, he was equipped with dogs. But he did not make the best use of them by any means. The problem with that is, with an expedition that's largely naval, the experience with dogs is not strong in those circumstances. And one really needs two things. The dogs have to be properly trained to work with the men, and the men must know and understand the dogs for it to be effective. When neither of these is fully accomplished, then their use is far less effective than it can be in proper experienced dog hands. Someone who knows well to handle them, a good example is Amundsen, of course.
Scott returned home with much on his mind, for whilst in Oslo he learnt of plans in other countries for expeditions to the pole. Scott returned to Britain, determined to speed the British effort along. Firstly, a ship strong enough to force a way through Antarctic ice was needed. The tender chosen came from the Dundee Shipbuilders Company, who had a vast experience of building whaling ships, which could withstand the harsh Arctic regions. The ship needed to be made of wood to avoid hindering magnetic observations, which were essential to the expedition. First and foremost, the trip was to be a scientific survey, but the issues were already being muddled by some. The Discovery was launched on the 21st of March 1901, and Scott's expedition plans were nearly complete. Now a crew was needed. Gradually, a scientific team was assembled, all personally chosen by Scott, who had listened carefully to the recommendations and advice of fellow officers. His first recruit was, of course, Dr. Edward Wilson, who was not only a fine painter, but also a zoologist. Wilson was a valued friend and important ally over the next few years. Another significant recruitment in Scott's story was Discovery's third mate, Ernest Shackleton, a gregarious, easygoing charmer with the aura of a rebel about him. Given Scott's serious nature, the two men were poles apart, and later on became rivals.
I think in any expedition like theirs, you need a reasonable mix of characters. I think Scott was very much the leader, and people like Shackleton, who perhaps wasn't the organisational leader, but was certainly very much the link between some of the people in the sort of lower ranks, if you like. I mean, it was still very much along military lines, obviously because of the sort of nature of these expeditions at that time. But I think that Shackleton was one of the chaps and could get on with everybody in the expedition, whereas Scott was very much the leader, and he felt that he had to make all the difficult decisions. Subsequently, of course, Shackleton went back to the Antarctic and led his own expeditions, and very successfully, and never lost a man in an expedition himself.
On August the 6th, 1901, Discovery set sail from the Isle of Wight towards the Antarctic. Sir Clemens Markham later wrote, "No finer set of men left these shores, nor were men ever led by a finer captain." Discovery journeyed south to New Zealand, where she took new supplies on board and received her last overhaul before sailing on into the unknown Antarctic regions. In November, the vessel passed through the 60th parallel, and amid great excitement, the crew got their first sight of ice. On January 9th, the Discovery finally landed on the continent of Antarctica. Ferocious 100-mile-an-hour winds battered the ship, and jagged icebergs raced by her sides. "We are here to fight the elements with their weapons," wrote Scott, "and once and for all, this has taught me not to undervalue the enemy." In February, after a lengthy journey along the Great Ice Barrier, the Discovery crew arrived in McMurdo Sound to begin work on a hut for winter quarters. The construction work took longer than anticipated, but then a more pressing problem became apparent. The dog teams were becoming uncontrollable. As the dogs snarled, Nansen's advice must have rung in Scott's ears.
Scott knew that dogs were a possibility. He knew that tracked vehicles, it was he that took the very first motor machine down in Antarctica. He was perfectly prepared to be flexible. It was Shackleton who a few years later took the first tracked vehicle ever, the predecessor of the skidoo.
In the field work, when we're out collecting the data, most of the travel is by skidoos, as sort of small motorised snowmobiles, just towing sledges, and they're small enough to be able to get around to a lot of areas that might be inaccessible to larger vehicles. We've got sledges for carrying all the equipment.
It would have been nice to have the dogs there, but they were taken out in 1994, I believe. We use skidoos now instead to travel about, which are perhaps, well, they're quite reliable, but they certainly haven't got the character.
Amundsen was perfectly stuck with dogs. He came from a country where dogs were used all the time. They certainly weren't in Britain. And so he knew that there was a strong possibility. Likewise, the Norwegians ski. The Brits don't ski. So they were using something which was familiar to them. The Navy were using a whole lot of things, none of which were familiar to them, other than the British tradition of hauling your own weights.
The confidence of the party was also shaken by an incident at Cape Crozier, when an exploration team got caught in blizzards. In the resulting chaos, one man was lost to the icy sea. Incredibly, every other man made it back to the ship, but it was a grave reminder of the dangers surrounding them.
When there's daylight, all you can see is white. It's snowing, the wind's picking up the snow and just blasting it into you, and everything is white. We have hand lines between buildings to help you find your way around if you're on base. So if you lose sight of one of those, you could be in trouble, but we hang on to those so we have an idea of where we're going.
The most ever-present hazard for polar explorers was frostbite. This devastating condition caused slow blackening of the extremities, and the only remedy was amputation.
Frostbite, again, is a very real risk. But again, these days, we've got fairly good clothing, so you should be able to avoid getting frostbite or any other sort of cold injuries. Again, I think we have a slightly more modern attitude these days to combating the cold and working in the cold. In that if you feel yourself getting cold, rather than pushing on the way that people might have done in Scott's days in the heroic age, sensible people, you'll stop and you'll warm your hands up if it was your hands that are getting cold, or warm your feet up, or just get in some shelter if you feel yourself getting cold.
During the long winter months, Scott prepared for the spring journey to the South Pole. He decided on a team of 3 men, which included himself, Wilson, and Shackleton. It was typical of Scott to recognize Shackleton's qualities and appreciate how useful they would be on the difficult march south. Any personal feelings were buried for the sake of the cause.
And it was Wilson who suggested to Scott, once they were in the Antarctic, that Shackleton should join Scott and himself on the first attempt to sledge towards the South Pole.
On November the 15th, the last of the support groups turned back towards base, leaving Scott, Wilson, and Shackleton with the dogs to journey forward towards the pole. Although the 3 men made Herculean efforts, progress averaged only 4 miles per day, and before long, the dogs began to weaken and die. The Enterprise took on a shambolic appearance, with Scott, Shackleton, and Wilson yelling frantically and the dogs pulling sporadically in different directions. By December, illness had struck. Shackleton had contracted scurvy in his mouth, and Wilson was suffering from snow blindness.
There's very few cases of snow blindness these days because everyone will have good sunglasses and goggles, just out of comfort really you tend to wear them all the time because the sun can be very bright, especially on sunny days when it's reflecting back from the snow. It's more comfortable to wear sunglasses, and that stops snow blindness completely. I think if you are unfortunate enough to get snow blindness, it's very painful at the time, but it is completely recoverable. In the long term, I don't think there's any long-term damage done to the eyes.
They had reached the 82nd parallel, but Scott decided that their situation was so severe that they would have to turn back. They now faced the long and painful journey back to the ship. The dogs were dying now at the rate of 1 per day, and their plight broke Scott's heart.
He has pulled like a Trojan throughout. His stout little heart bore him up, till his legs failed beneath him and he fell, never to rise again.
By now, Shackleton was struggling for breath and spitting out blood. He had to be borne upon the sledges, and on January the 18th, he collapsed completely. Scott was typically sympathetic to his situation.
He is very plucky about it, for he does not complain, although there is no doubt he is suffering badly.
On the 28th of January, the party, almost spent, reached Depot A, where they had left supplies on their outward journey. With enough food, Shackleton's condition improved, and on February the 3rd they completed their final 60-mile leg back to Discovery, to a tumultuous welcome from the crew. There was a huge celebration aboard the Discovery that night. The expedition remained in the Antarctic region for a further 18 months, conducting scientific experiments and surveys. Unexpectedly, Scott sent Shackleton home, a decision which was justified on the grounds of his poor health, although some members of the crew felt there was a degree of personal feeling involved. Shackleton, his pride hurt, stood on the deck of the relief ship as it set sail to take him home, and wept. Eventually, the rest of the crew arrived back in Britain in September 1904. A shy, introverted man, Scott found the sudden demands of lectures, medal presentations, and society parties difficult to cope with. "I've had enough of notoriety to last me a lifetime. There's been no peace, no quiet, nothing but one mad rush," he wrote to a friend. It was with relief he returned to the Navy in August 1906, aboard HMS Victorious. Unable to escape the feeling that the job was only half done, Scott began to formulate plans to return south. By the following March, Scott was nearing the target for funding of the trip. He was also well on his way to completing the list of his new crew. Among the names were Birdie Bowers, the soldier Lawrence, Titus Oates, Atkinson, the surgeon, and Mears, who would be responsible for the dogs. From the previous expedition in 1902 were Edward Evans, Edgar Evans, and Stoker Lashley. Nansen again urged Scott to take a team of fully trained dogs. At this time, Roald Amundsen was engaged in an expedition to the North Pole, showing to what fine use dogs could be put.
The Norwegian explorers, some of them had spent a lot of time working in the Arctic with experts who have been running dogs for years and years, so they had a lot more experience and a lot more skills already, and it could be that even with the best will in the world, Scott and his men might not have had enough time to learn all the skills required to run the teams and train them properly.
Scott's previous bad experiences led him to decide that ponies should accompany the dogs on the journey. This has often been cited as the decision which cost Scott and his companions their lives.
It could be that the way they managed the ponies or the particular animals they had, they weren't the best animals, so it could be that the attempt was doomed from the start in terms of the support that the animals could give them. But I think the dogs in particular proved very useful at the time, but there weren't enough of them, and they weren't deployed in such a way to really contribute to the success of the trip, and it eventually ended up in failure.
Subsequent events were to prove well-trained and expertly handled dogs would certainly take a team to the pole and return them safely. Although he had originally intended to repurchase the Discovery to make their long voyage, Scott eventually decided upon the Terra Nova. Fortunately, the Discovery underwent a refit and is now preserved in all her glory at Discovery Point in Dundee, affording a glimpse of the conditions the men journeyed to the Antarctic in. The Terra Nova set sail on June the 1st, 1910, without Scott, who was still raising money and would join the ship at Cape Town. In October, the Terra Nova arrived in Melbourne, where the grimmest news awaited Scott. It had transpired that the Norwegian, Amundsen, who had been heading for the North Pole, had been beaten there by Robert Peary and had been forced to revise his plans. Amundsen's cable to Scott was short and to the point.
Amundsen thought the North Pole had been reached. If Cook and Peary had been more truthful about where they got, then it's very probable that Amundsen would have gone for the North Pole as originally planned. In those circumstances, Scott would have still continued to the South Pole. So sitting here in an armchair, one could then suggest Amundsen might have got the North quite definitely, and Scott might have survived the South. But would either of them been quite so famous as now the circumstances with the competition for the South Pole?
It was on November the 29th that the Terra Nova eventually set sail for the Antarctic. But not before Scott told waiting newsmen, "We may get through, we may not. We may lose our lives, we may be wiped out. It is all a matter of providence and luck." These words may seem melodramatic now, but to Scott, they were merely an honest reflection of his feelings towards the task ahead. The journey towards Antarctica was particularly rough, with the animals, 19 ponies and 34 dogs, bearing the brunt of the angry seas. Evans recorded that the dogs were almost hanging by their chains, whilst Oates, in charge of the poor ponies, worked like a Trojan to protect them as the ship rolled and lurched. In January, the ship arrived at Cape Evans on McMurdo Sound and the Hut Point. Dispirited to find the old hut in an extremely poor state of repair, they had nonetheless soon established excellent new quarters from which to begin their work. The next step was to establish a forward depot known as 1 Ton Depot, which Scott hoped to build on latitude 80 degrees south. In the event, appalling weather truncated their march, and the depot was built 20 miles to the north of the intended spot. These were, as we shall see, to be 20 crucial miles. On February the 4th, the Terra Nova, on its journey from the east, sailed into the Bay of Whales, to be confronted by the sight of a ship moored there. It did not take them long to discover it was the Fram, Amundsen's ship. One astonished crewman later wrote, "They had 120 dogs and are going to the pole. No science, no nothing, just the pole." Although he conceded that the Norwegians seemed charming men, even the perfidious Amundsen. They have unlimited dogs and experience in snow travelling that could be beaten by no collection of men in the world. I think that the two parties will reach the pole next year, but God only knows which will get there first.
Amundsen's the science done was fairly minimal. Meteorology was recorded, but the mapping and survey was nowhere near to the same extent. In a way, with the two expeditions going to the pole, it's frequently called a race, but there's more to it than that. Scott's expedition was mapping and exploring side valleys and glaciers all the way. You couldn't exactly say it was on full speed. Amundsen's maps and the cairns and notes he left were perfectly adequate to get back safely, but not very much else. In one or two places, the actual route he took to reach the pole is uncertain, whereas Scott we have maps carefully laid down all the way. There was quite a different character between the two South Pole journeys.
After the long, sunless Antarctic winter, it was decided to begin the march to the South Pole on November the 1st, 1911. The men would split into two groups, the advance and main parties. The parties marched 15 miles apart, the advance party making the route as it progressed. Every 65 miles, depots were established for the journey back. The following main party was led by Scott and contained the majority of the dogs and ponies. Unbeknown to Scott, Amundsen and his party were already 5 degrees further southward, which meant that in the race to the South Pole, he had established an unassailable lead. Scott's men marched on, but by the end of November, the weather had worsened, forcing them to camp. It was December the 8th before any further progress was made, but after initial hopeful signs that the weather had broken, the snow and wind descended upon them once more.
I would have thought that the only forecasting tools they could have had would be the people standing on the ground at that time and looking up at the sky and looking at the weather. The only advance warning they would have had of a storm arriving would be as it came in, and maybe the clouds came over and the wind picked up and it started snowing.
Scott was now faced with another terrible problem. The ponies were completely and utterly spent. They floundered and struggled pitifully, snow up to their bellies, until the only way to move them was to beat them. Scott mercifully had them all shot, ending their misery. But because they were slaughtered many miles short of the objective, all sledge hauling from then had to be done by manpower alone.
Now, a lot of people thought that, in fact, human power was more effective and better designed than dog power or even machine power. But it wasn't until 1993 that we finally proved that Scott was correct, because we have managed to cross the entire continent, not just halfway to the pole, using nothing, no outside help whatsoever, hauling all our own equipment. Many American and Soviet expeditions have tried to cross the whole continent using either dogs or machines, whatever sorts of machines, but neither the dog nor the machine has proved sufficiently fuel efficient to be able to do so without resupply at some point. Humans can. There was a great basis of correctness in Scott's thoughts when comparing dogs with people.
The bad weather lasted until the 17th of December, when there was a relative improvement enabling the party to make much better progress. In late December, the time came for Scott to decide upon the summit party, the one sledge team which would actually go to the pole, and the final assault party, the men who would travel to within one short step before turning back. The remaining men returned to Cape Evans immediately. The final assault party would be Edward Evans, Crean, and Lashley. This left the summit party, consisting of Scott, Wilson, Evans, Bowers, and Oates. The 8 men who remained ensured that Christmas Day was celebrated with a good meal. They feasted on slices of horse meat, onion, and curry powder, followed by plum pudding. But the journey was beginning to take its toll. Scott noted sledging difficulties, and Wilson was beset with his old problem of snowblindness. However, New Year's Eve arrived with only 170 miles to travel and food in plenty. The party was suddenly awash with optimism. It was on January the 4th that the time came for the final assault party to turn north, leaving the remaining 5 men to attack the pole. Crean wept openly, and Lashley was so overcome he was unable to speak. The next few days' march were the hardest they had known, but determination and the knowledge that every exhausting step brought the pole a little nearer kept them going. On January the 10th, Scott wrote in his diary, "Only 85 miles from the pole, but it's going to be a stiff pull both ways, apparently. I never had such pulling. All the time the sledge rasps and creaks. We have covered 6 miles, but at a fearful cost to ourselves. Still, it is wonderful to think that 2 long marches would land us at the pole." By Tuesday the 16th, his entry told a different tale.
About the second hour of the march, Bowers' sharp eyes detected what he thought was a cairn. He was uneasy about it, but argued that it must be a sastrugi. We marched on and found that it was a black flag attached to a sledge carry. Nearby was the remains of a camp. This told the whole story. The Norwegians have forestalled us and are the first to the pole.
The disappointment which was felt by Scott and his men must have been overwhelming. 13 years of planning, of striving to be the first man to set foot at the pole was over. The Norwegians had arrived at the pole only 1 month earlier, December the 14th, 1911. Scott and his devastated party discovered their tent containing the names of the 5 men in the party, with a letter to King Haakon. The contrast in fortune between the Norwegian party and Scott's own was stark. Their journey, which had been completed in 99 days, was made in fine weather, allowing average progress of nearly 20 miles a day. The dogs, so well bred and trained, had performed wonderfully and food was plentiful. Apparently the dogs even gained weight. There is no doubt that the Norwegian effort had been brilliantly planned and professionally executed.
Scott's expedition arrived 33 days after the Norwegians had left. They found the flag, they found the tent, and all of these materials remaining there. The 2 expeditions did the same calculations, the positions, and backed each other up perfectly. There's no doubt about the South Pole. There was a letter left by Amundsen, addressed to the King of Norway, and the object of that was, if he failed to return, then the next person there would deliver the letter and the proof would be forthcoming. And that was a wise precaution.
Beaten to the pole, the Polar Party now faced the dreadful prospect of an 800-mile march back to Cape Evans, cold and very weary. Scott noted the condition of the men was deteriorating, particularly Evans, who had suffered several minor injuries and had weakened badly.
Today has been the worst day we have had on the trip. I have never seen such a mess of ice. I have no idea where we are, or how far to the next depot. I have ordered a reduction in rations. We must get there tomorrow.
Evans's condition was now critical, and it was obvious to the rest of the party that their companion was slowly dying. On the 17th of February, he fell into a coma, and at around midnight became the first to die on the long polar march. On February the 18th, the rest of the summit party reached the camp at the foot of the glacier where the ponies had been slaughtered. Their first full meal in a month consisted of horse meat. Food shortages were made worse by a new threat, the shortage of oil. The temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees centigrade, freezing their stores of paraffin.
Many of the early Antarctic explorers died of exposure, and certainly one of the factors that finished Scott and his team members off was the cold, was the lack of adequate clothing. They had a lot of natural fibres that when they sweated, that actually froze to their body.
We know that their diet was a lot poorer in the days of Scott's expeditions, and I think there'll be a long-term degeneration, probably mentally and physically, that will affect your judgment in all the things you're doing as well.
One of the contributing factors to the tragic end of those returning from the pole was the weather. They were going across the ice barrier after the equinox. It was getting progressively colder. There's 2 things to think about. 1, the temperature, it's approaching minus 40, and 2, the wind. An intense wind, a blizzard in that temperature, is a very powerful combination. You lose heat rapidly. Frostbite can be a severe problem. Indeed, in the case of Oates, his limbs remained frostbitten until he left the tent.
In fact, all 4 men were now suffering terribly with the side effects of the cold. On their arrival at the depot at Mount Hooper on March the 9th, Scott had hoped to find Cherry Garrard with the dogs, which would have undoubtedly saved their lives. But bad weather had beaten the team back to One Ton Depot, 72 long miles away. At this point, Scott ordered that each man should be given the means to end their suffering, and Wilson dutifully handed every man 30 opium tablets each. It was now that Titus Oates made his famous selfless sacrifice. He had begged to be left in his tent to die, but the others had steadfastly refused. Another blizzard raged, and as the wind ripped savagely at their tiny tent, Oates raised himself painfully to his frost-bitten feet. "I'm just going outside, and maybe some time." With these words, the brave soldier staggered from the tent, never to be seen again. All hope had now disappeared. The three men had no oil, barely 2 days' food, and the appalling blizzard had not abated. Scott himself now had a badly frostbitten right foot, which he knew, even if by some miracle they did make it to One Ton Depot, would have to be amputated. Wilson and Bowers were very near to death. Wilson's moving last letter was to his beloved parents.
Look forward earnestly to the day when we shall all be together in the hereafter. It is according to God's will and all for the best. I have had a very happy life, and I look forward to a very happy life in the hereafter.
On March the 29th, 1912, Robert Falcon Scott made what he thought would be his last entry in his diary. It speaks volume for the strength and sheer force of will which Scott possessed, that in fact he completed no less than 12 more letters. All were in a legible hand, all were clear-minded and coherent. He wrote to the mothers of Oates and Bowers, and to Wilson's wife, to naval colleagues, and of course to his much-loved wife Kathleen. But it is his remarkable message to the public which perhaps encapsulates Scott as a man. For my own sake, I do not regret this journey which has shown that Englishmen can endure hardships, help one another, and meet death with as great a fortitude as ever in the past. We took risks, we knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint, but how to the will of Providence, determined still to do our best to the last. The dead men were found on 12th of November 1912. It was the surgeon, Atkinson, who was first to the tent, now virtually buried in the deep white snow. Petty Officer Williamson, one of the search party, wrote later, "Commander Scott's face was very pinched, and his hands, I should say, had been terribly frostbitten. Never again in my life do I want to behold the sights we have just seen." The sad party built a cairn over the remains of Robert Scott and his men, and sang "Onward, Christian Soldiers," Scott's favourite hymn. A little later, an inscription was carved on a cross, high on the hill, overlooking Hut Point at Cape Evans. For Robert Falcon Scott, it was surely the perfect epitaph. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.
I think he has received a bad press to some extent. He's still viewed very much as the person who failed to get to the pole first, rather than someone who was a pioneer in Antarctic science. And for that, I think it's rather unfortunate, really.
They made a preliminary first step along the direction of the research we do today, if only for the basic mapping that they did. The mapping of the continent is a fairly basic part of any research. You know, they began that process that's carried on to this day.
Well, if it wasn't for Scott's expedition to the Antarctic, then people like me wouldn't have the opportunity to be working as an atmospheric chemist in Antarctica today. You know, Scott opened a door to the world's most natural environment that we have.
As dawn broke on October 13th, 1492, 3 small Spanish ships dropped anchor off the coast of a tiny island in what would later be known as the Caribbean Sea. Watched from the trees by the timid inhabitants, a party of men began to row ashore. They were the first Europeans the natives had ever seen. Christopher Columbus was about to discover a new world, and within a few short years, turn a paradise into a hell. The closing years of the 15th century were a time of great change and awakening for Europe. In a continent for years riven by internal division and conflict, a new spirit of inquiry was abroad. This period became known to future generations as the Renaissance. And nowhere was it stronger than in the field of exploration. An expanding Europe was desperate to break its bonds and spread its influence into the world beyond. European governments and merchants began to give increasing attention to the possibility of finding a new route to the riches of India and Cathay, which we call China. Land routes to the east had been established many years earlier, but overland trade was a slow and risky business, now made more expensive and uncertain by the presence across the trade routes of new Muslim kingdoms. It was in these circumstances that some Western nations began to consider a new possibility. Could they reach the riches of the East by sea?
In the 15th century, almost everyone believed that the world was a sphere. In 1492, in Nuremberg, a German cartographer called Martin Beheim made a globe, and that globe represents, as near as possible, the 15th century perception of the world as the Middle Ages knew it. Now, the 15th century knew there are islands in the Atlantic. There are, in fact, a lot of islands in the Atlantic. But what they didn't know is that they'd already discovered them all. The Cape Verdes, the Azores, and the Canaries. There were no other islands in the Atlantic. But Martin Beheim's globe shows an Atlantic Ocean with one large island in it, and that is Japan. It shows a world, it's the last representation of the world as the Middle Ages knew it, with one ocean on the left-hand side of the ocean section. You can see Cathay, China, and on the right-hand side you can see Europe. It's the last representation of a world without America in it.
It was into this restless and rapidly changing world that Christopher Columbus was born. Very little is known with certainty about his early years, and even the spelling of his name varies widely. He used the form Colon as his surname, but it is by the Latin version that Columbus is known to history. Christopher was born in Genoa, on the shores of the Mediterranean, in about the year 1451, the eldest son of a wool weaver. From about the age of 14, Columbus had chosen the life of a seaman, voyaging widely in the Mediterranean. Throughout his life, Columbus customarily clothed his thoughts and plans in a cloak of secrecy. So, even today, we cannot be sure what he expected to find when he sailed westwards. He may have been drawn by hopes of discovering the fabled islands and lands of legend, just as much as finding a new seaward route to China and the Indies. Certainly, using a wide variety of sources, ancient writings on travel and cosmology, biblical references, and travelers' tales of unknown islands, and even of strange plants and bodies which had been washed up on the shores of the Azores, he developed a detailed theory of what he thought lay to the west.
The thing to remember about Columbus was that he wasn't actually an original thinker. He was aware of, and he used the theories of the day, theories that were current in his time, and he developed and elaborated these through his personal experience, both as a mariner and a trader in the Mediterranean, and more especially in the Atlantic, which was known as the Ocean Sea in those days. Now, Columbus didn't just pick up the theories that were lying around, he did his own work. Now, he was aware of calculations of the size of the Atlantic. For instance, those of Toscanelli, who had calculated the Atlantic at being something like 5,000 nautical miles. He did his own calculations and arrived at a figure which was rather less than that. As it turned out, Columbus was rather more accurate in his estimate than people like Toscanelli and the other cosmographers who were working on the same sorts of problems.
In theory, it was always possible to sail to the east using the western route across the ocean. The big question was, how wide was the ocean? Was this theory something which could be achieved in practice? And it's that question that Columbus spent many years, 10 years or so, trying to answer in his preparations for the 1492 voyage.
But it was one thing for Columbus to develop his theory. Finding the means to prove it was quite another matter. He needed ships, men, and money, and the only way to obtain these was with the aid of a wealthy patron. In 1484, Columbus took his proposal for a western voyage to King John I of Portugal, but met with a cool reception. The Portuguese king regarded Columbus as a big talker and boastful, and he and his experts, heavily involved in Portugal's explorations of the African coast route to the east, gave the Genoan little credit. In the years following, Columbus was vainly to seek backing from France and England, but his hopes increasingly rested with Spain and its joint monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. He first had audience with the Spanish rulers in 1486, and Isabella, at least, widely regarded as one of the most able rulers of the period, seemed to be interested in Columbus's schemes. A commission was appointed to consider them. But the time was not yet ripe for action. Spanish energies were currently devoted to the war to expel the Moors from their last foothold in Spain. And until this was achieved, there was no time or energy to devote to fantastic schemes for exploration. The next 6 years were among the most frustrating of Columbus's life. Whilst he dragged his heels, the commission deliberated and finally delivered their verdict. Columbus's plan, the experts said, rested upon weak foundations and seemed uncertain and impossible to any educated person. The only glimmer of hope came from Isabella, who told Columbus to apply to her again once the war against the Moors was over. Negotiations were resumed late in 1491, and almost foundered over Columbus's high demands. He required the title of Admiral of the Ocean, and, more seriously, to be made viceroy of any new lands that were discovered, and 10% of the proceeds of any trade with them. His proposals were almost rejected again, until the keeper of Ferdinand's purse pointed out that the voyage would cost less than 1 week's expenditure on the upkeep of the royal court. The popular legend that Queen Isabella pawned her jewels to finance the expedition is untrue. The next step was for Columbus to find ships for his voyage and the crews to man them. He established his base at the little port of Palos, not far from Cadiz. Here, experienced sailors were plentiful. Again, contrary to legend, Columbus does not seem to have experienced any great difficulty in recruiting men. Very few of his crew were the convicts of popular myth. There were plenty of good, capable seamen with a taste for adventure and gold. And Columbus had the support of several local ship-owning families, notably the Pinzon brothers, Martin and Vicente, who were to be 2 of his captains. In all, Columbus recruited about 90 men. As well as sailors, the expedition included several specialists. Luis de Torres, whose knowledge of Arabic was expected to prove useful, Rodrigo del Escobado, who was to keep the official record of the voyage, and a royal official, Rodrigo Sanchez, who was to make sure that the Spanish crown received its fair share of any profits. Columbus was also given official letters of introduction to the great Khan of China and any other foreign potentates whom he might encounter. Interestingly, though armed for self-defense, the contingent did not include any soldiers. The expedition consisted of 3 ships. Most famous was Columbus's flagship, variously called La Gallega, after Galicia, its place of origin, or more usually the Santa Maria, though to her crew she was apparently known as the Dirty Mary. Santa Maria was a three-masted square rigger of around 100 tons. Columbus's other two vessels were smaller. The Nina, of some 60 tons and 70 foot in length, captained by Vicente Pinzon, and the Pinta, slightly larger under his brother Martin. Though originally caravels, one was converted into a square rigger soon after the voyage began.
The two ships provided by the Crown came as a result of the town of Palos having committed a misdemeanor, and they were punished by having to provide these two ships and the crews. The third ship, the flagship, the Santa Maria, was provided by private investment. As it turned out, the two ships from Palos were much more suitable for this voyage because they were caravels. They were the newer sort of ship available in Mediterranean waters, but a kind of ship which was quite well suited for transatlantic crossing. It was fast and it was maneuverable, and Columbus subsequently complained bitterly that his flagship, the Santa Maria, was useless in the Caribbean because he couldn't maneuver it as effectively as he could the other two ships.
Early on August 3rd, 1492, Columbus's ships weighed anchor and stood out to sea. The great adventure had begun. Columbus headed south for the Canary Islands and took advantage of the prevailing easterly winds in that quarter to guide him across the great ocean. Another factor was that, according to Columbus's calculations, Quinsay lay in the same latitude as the Canaries. Simply heading more or less on a straight course was bound to bring him to its shores. Pausing to take fresh water and extra provisions on board, Columbus headed west again from the Canaries on September 6th. He met with mainly favorable winds, and the little flotilla made rapid progress into the unknown. Probably because he feared discontent amongst his men, and also perhaps because of his passion for secrecy, Columbus kept two records of his daily progress. One, which he kept to himself, recorded what Columbus believed to be the actual distance which he had covered. The other, for the consumption of his crew, suggested a faster rate of progress, which, in fact, seems to have been the more accurate. During the first 10 days of their voyage, Columbus and his ships made a total of some 1,160 miles, flying before the steady easterly trade winds. These were, for Columbus, the happiest days of the voyage. What a delight were the savor of the mornings, he wrote, like April in Andalusia. The only thing wanting was to hear the nightingale. By about September 19th, both the Admiral of the Ocean and his men were beginning to grow anxious. Soundings showed no sign of the ocean bottom. According to popular myth, there then came a cry of "Land!" from a lookout, and the excited Columbus ordered his men to share in a hymn of thanksgiving and ordered course to be set towards the apparent island. It is possible that all that had been sighted was a bank of cloud, and morale dropped further when a period of slight winds and slow progress set in. Then, on October 7th, drooping spirits were revived. Great flocks of birds, which we now know to have been part of the annual autumn migration from North America to the West Indies, were sighted heading southwest, and Columbus ordered course to be altered to follow them. But it seems clear that there was still discontent among some of the men about where exactly Columbus was leading them. This almost certainly never reached the point of mutiny, which has been suggested by some writers. But Columbus and his commanders evidently agreed to turn back if no land was sighted in the next 3 or 4 days. However, as the hours went by, sightings of floating branches, some with leaves on them, made it obvious that land could not be far away. All through the night of October 11th, the little fleet pressed on before a stiff breeze. Lookouts, eager to earn the royal reward of a comfortable sum of money and a silk doublet for the first man to sight land, strained at the masthead. At about 10 p.m. on the night of October 11th, both Columbus and a lookout claimed to see a light like a little wax candle rising and falling. This was almost certainly an illusion caused by the strain of prolonged watching, though this did not prevent Columbus from later appropriating the reward for himself. Then, at about 2 a.m. on the morning of October 12th, Rodrigo de Triana, lookout on the Pinta, spotted what would have looked like a white cliff in the moonlight. This time there was no mistake. At daylight, Columbus began to close in on the small island, which was now clearly visible. The long voyage was over, and the course of world history was about to change forever. There is still dispute about the island on which Columbus had made his landfall. At least 12 alternative sites have been suggested. At about noon on October 12th, Columbus's men became the first Spaniards to set foot on the soil of the New World. Watched cautiously by a few natives, Columbus and his men set up the standards of Castile and of the expedition, and, all having rendered thanks to our Lord, kneeling on the ground, embracing it with tears of joy for the immeasurable mercy of having reached it, the admiral rose and gave the island the name of San Salvador. It is unclear what land Columbus thought he had reached, but he saw no reason to suspect that the almost naked people who timidly came forward to meet him were not Chinese or Indian.
We actually know very little about the natives of the Caribbean islands at the time of Columbus, for 2 reasons. First of all, they had no written language and therefore left no written records of their own. And secondly, because their oral culture, their oral history, was destroyed along with the people by the Spaniards. Our knowledge of the indigenous population of the Caribbean comes solely from European accounts, from the accounts of Europeans who'd encountered them, most particularly the Spaniards. Of course, having to rely on such accounts means that we have a distorted picture of the natives and their culture. The most obvious distortion being, of course, the word Indian. This was given to them by Columbus in the belief that he'd made landfall off the Asian landmass. It was adopted by the Spaniards and then has come down to the rest of us through the Spaniards. So the term Indian is, of course, simply a reflection of the distortion of the accounts of the natives as they were encountered by those early settlers and explorers.
Columbus was apparently initially quite touched by the kindness and friendliness of the Taínos inhabitants of the island he called San Salvador, writing, "They invite you to share anything they possess, and show as much love as if their hearts went with it." But a darker side to his thinking quickly became apparent when Columbus added, "They ought to be good servants and of good intelligence. I believe that they would easily be made Christians, because it seemed to me that they had no religion. Our Lord pleasing, I will carry off 6 of them at my departure to your highnesses, in order that they may learn to speak." By sign language, the natives indicated that other islands lay to the west, and Columbus put to sea once more, kidnapping 6 inhabitants to act as guides. During the next few days, the expedition came across numerous other islands, discovering on them many exotic and new plants, fine trees and maize and sweet potatoes, But apart from the tantalizing evidence of the ornaments worn by the natives, there was no sign of what was increasingly becoming the Spaniards' chief desire: gold. Informed by the islanders of a larger island, which they called Colba, Columbus, perhaps believing this might be the mainland of China, resumed his voyage, and on October 28th anchored off the coast of Cuba. But again, his hopes were to meet with frustration. A party dispatched inland in search of evidence of Chinese or Japanese civilization returned empty-handed, apart from news of a strange practice which they had observed. They had met many people who were going to their village with a firebrand in the hand and herbs to drink the smoke thereof. It was Europe's first experience of tobacco. Rumors of gold abounded. Columbus was told of an island called Babik, where the people gathered gold on the beach by candlelight. Possibly fired by these tales, Martin Pinzon and his Pinto slipped away alone on a private gold hunting expedition, leaving Columbus with the 2 other vessels to sail on. On December 8th, Columbus reached yet another island, and the admiral, seeing the grandeur and beauty of this island and its resemblance to the land of Spain, christened it La Isla Española, later to become Hispaniola. In an ominous moment for the island's unsuspecting Taínos inhabitants, who welcomed Columbus in the same fashion as the islanders elsewhere, the admiral noted the rich ornaments worn by a local chief, or cacique, and his entourage, and confided to his journal that the people were very cowardly, fit to be ordered about, and made to work, sew, and do anything else that may be needed. It is clear that Columbus's thoughts were turning from his proclaimed objective of seeking a route to the Indies to the possibilities of conquering and colonizing these newfound lands. On December 22nd, Columbus received a message from Guacanagari, a powerful cacique in what is now northwestern Hispaniola, inviting him to visit. And, especially attractive to Columbus, enclosing as a gift a richly ornamented belt with a gold buckle. This was a temptation impossible for Columbus to resist. But en route, disaster struck. Exhausted by all-night entertainment, the crew of the Santa Maria failed to keep watch on the night of Christmas Day. Just before midnight, the ship ran onto a reef and was wrecked. Though with the help of Guacanagri and his people, the crew and most of the contents of the Santa Maria were saved, Columbus was left only with the little Nina, much too small a vessel to carry all of his men back home to Spain. This gave him a pretext to do what may already have been in his mind, to establish a permanent settlement in the newly discovered islands. With increasing evidence that gold must be plentiful and close at hand, there were plenty of volunteers to man the new settlement. Using timber from the Santa Maria, a small fort, itself perhaps evidence of the Spaniards' true intentions toward the friendly people of the islands, was constructed on a sand spit on the northwestern coast of Hispaniola, and 39 men selected to garrison it. There is no doubt that Columbus was already considering the potential of Spain's new subjects as slaves. On January 4th, 1493, Columbus and the Nina set sail on the first stage of the long voyage home. 2 days later, they encountered the Pinta, and Pinzon's news was such as to cause Columbus to forgive his desertion. Penetrating into the interior of Hispaniola, Martin Pinzon and his men had found gold in abundance. After an ominous development, engaging in a brief skirmish with some Taínos at Samana Bay, Columbus set course for Spain. He carried with him about a dozen hapless Taínos captives to display to the Spanish monarchs. The voyage home was a perilous one. The two little ships encountered near hurricane conditions and came close to foundering. Indeed, Columbus lost sight of Pinzon and the Pinta and gave them up for lost. However, Nina at length came safely to anchor in the Azores on the 18th of February, 1493. But the explorer's troubles were not yet over. Contrary winds drove him into Lisbon instead of a Spanish harbor, and he could not be certain how he would be received by King John of Portugal when the latter realized that he had missed the chance of gaining for himself the new territories of the Indies. However, John rejected advice that he should imprison Columbus, contenting himself with the rueful comment, "Why did I let slip such a wonderful chance?" Allowed to resume his journey, Columbus dropped anchor at Palos at about noon on March 15th, after a voyage lasting 224 days. He was about to discover that the mortally sick Martin Pinzon had reached Spain shortly before him, but perhaps fortunately for Columbus's reputation, had died before he could give his version of events to Ferdinand and Isabella. When, about April 20th, Columbus, with his cavalcade of natives, or those who had survived the voyage, in their full exotic attire and bearing strange gifts, including some gold, reached the court of Barcelona, he received a hero's welcome. Confirmed in all the titles and privileges which he had demanded, it was the Genoese sailor's finest hour.
It vindicated all he'd said about his voyage across the Atlantic. It vindicated the support he'd received in order to mount that voyage. And most of all, it vindicated or gave vindication to all the contractual arrangements he'd made with the Spanish monarchs. The direct result of that for him personally was that he was now Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and he was poised to become an extremely rich man if he could turn his discoveries in the New World into money.
In terms of his investors, it was an unmitigated disaster. Columbus had not found the great civilizations that he was hoping to make contact with across the ocean. He'd found some very beautiful islands, he'd found some natural resources, he'd found some gentle people, but he'd found nothing that was of any real interest to his investors. There are some significant omissions from his account of the first voyage, particularly the sinking of the Santa Maria, which was very embarrassing to him. To lose a ship of that size was considerable embarrassment. But what he did very successfully in the letters that he wrote in 1493 about the first voyage was to lay the basis for the funding of the second voyage.
Ferdinand and Isabella lost no time in authorizing Columbus to make a second voyage to the newly discovered lands, whatever they might actually be. This time there was to be a major expedition, and its object was clear: to establish a Spanish colony. A fleet of 17 ships carrying 1,200 men left Cadiz in September 1493. Significantly, they included both priests to convert the natives of the islands and soldiers to crush them. Discovering more islands, including Guadalupe and Puerto Rico en route, the expedition arrived at the post of Navidad to find that it had been burnt to the ground and its inhabitants slaughtered. In a foretaste of later events, Columbus's men had come into conflict with the Taínos over gold and the native women, and been massacred. There is no evidence that Columbus expressed particular regret or concern, though he did prevent vengeance being exacted on the loyal cacique, Guacanagari. Rather than rebuild the ill-fated settlement, Columbus chose to establish a new colony on the north side of Hispaniola. Named Isabella, it was badly sited and in an unhealthy spot. It would bring Columbus little but grief. Leaving the colonists to establish themselves, Columbus resumed his explorations. From now on, the darker side of his nature becomes steadily more apparent. The voyage was marked by continual clashes with the natives. Some, the Caribs, were accused of cannibalism by the Spaniards, but there is no evidence that this was true, and may have in part been used as an excuse to justify the increasing cruelty which the Spaniards displayed towards them. Columbus explored part of the coast of Cuba. Then, in an action difficult to understand, except as a sign of his desperation to prove to Ferdinand and Isabella that he had in fact reached the promised lands of Asia, the admiral forced his crew to swear an oath, on pain of having their tongues torn out if they broke it, that Cuba was in fact the long-sought continent. Returning in June 1494 to Isabella, Columbus found that life in his idyllic colony, left in the charge of his son, Diego, was already turning sour. Many of the colonists, disillusioned both with conditions and Columbus's leadership, had sent messages of complaint back to Spain. And poisoned by the Spaniards' lust for gold, the colonists were openly at war with the native people of Hispaniola. Attempts by the Taínos to resist were ruthlessly crushed by Columbus and his men, who made use of savage dogs and war horses, never before encountered by the natives. Columbus's formerly relatively moderate attitude towards them was rapidly changing. Disappointed in the amounts of gold which had so far been discovered, he proposed instead to sell the inhabitants as slaves. Some 1,500 were rounded up, and about a third of them shipped home to Spain. But the majority failed to survive the voyage, and because they felt that the trade would be too uneconomic to make a profit, and Spanish subjects should not be enslaved, Ferdinand and Isabella declined to authorize further shipments. The fate of the other captives was equally terrible. After allowing his men to take their pick of them, Columbus released the survivors to fend for themselves. It is said that the Taínos women fled in such terror that they abandoned their babies. Unable to meet the vast tribute in gold which the Spaniards demanded, and facing mutilation and execution for failure, the Taínos, or those of them who still survived, became fugitives in the mountains, where they were hunted down like wild beasts or starved. It was one of the darkest chapters in Spanish colonial history, known to other Europeans of the time as the Black Legend, which did much to engender hatred and fear of Spain throughout the 16th century. In the conquered islands, the work of devastation and genocide continued until there were no natives left to destroy. In 1492, the population of Hispaniola had been estimated to have been in the millions. By 1550, cruelty, murder, and disease had reduced the Taínos to less than 500 survivors.
The impact of the Spanish on the natives of the Caribbean islands was absolutely catastrophic, and for two main reasons. The first was disease. The Spaniards brought with them infectious diseases such as smallpox and measles, for which the natives had no natural immunity. Now this devastated their population, and as a consequence undermined their reproductive base. In other words, there were fewer people of reproductive age and ability to maintain the population. The second was rather more political and rather more insidious. The initial consequence of Spanish settlement on the islands was enslavement for the Indians, and Columbus himself was implicated in this. He was the first person to take Indians back to Spain as slaves.
Columbus's return to Spain in March 1496 was a much less triumphant affair than that of 3 years previously. Despite his ingenious claims, it was apparent to most people that Columbus had not reached Cathay or the Indies. The lands he had discovered were not producing gold in the quantities which he had promised, and the inhabitants, or those who survived, were not proving willing converts to Christianity. It seems that Ferdinand and Isabella were becoming disillusioned with the whole business of new lands in the West, and only the wish to prevent foreign powers from reaping any benefit which there were to be had there caused the Spanish monarchs to give continued but increasingly reluctant backing to Christopher Columbus. In March 1498, he was given permission to undertake a third voyage, partly financed by the sale of some of the Taíno slaves he had brought back with him. In some ways, though this was not fully appreciated at the time, Columbus's third voyage of discovery was perhaps his most important. As well as discovering the island of Trinidad, Columbus became the first European to set foot on the continent of South America, when, on August 5, 1498, he reached the coast of Venezuela. The landing was opposed this time not by natives, but by hordes of hostile monkeys. At first, Columbus did not realize that he had discovered a continent, assuming that he had landed on yet another island. But as he voyaged up the coast, he began to change his mind. What seems to have changed Columbus's mind was the sight of the vast estuary of the Orinoco River. Such a huge volume of fresh water, he felt, could only have been produced from a large landmass. But where and what this continent was remained unclear to the explorer. It might, of course, be Asia, but the evidence suggests that Columbus was by now beginning to come to the conclusion that he had indeed reached some completely uncharted land. He wrote to Ferdinand and Isabella, "Your Highnesses will gain these vast lands, which are an other world." Unfortunately, Columbus was now increasingly suffering from complications from the dysentery, which he had contracted in his previous voyage. These, it is now thought, were affecting his mental stability. And it was perhaps partly this that caused Columbus to engage in some flights of fancy which were extreme even for him. The new lands, he suggested, might contain great stores of gold, which is treasure, and with it, whoever has it may do what he wants in the world and may succeed in taking souls to paradise. And this latter task, Columbus suggested, might prove easier, because he hinted that his new discovery might even be the Garden of Eden. It is most unlikely that Spain's hard-headed rulers were impressed by their admiral's more fantastic theories. Indeed, they probably served to increase their doubts as to his reliability. These concerns would be strengthened still further by events when Columbus put in once more to the ill-starred colony of Isabella. Columbus found Hispaniola in a state of ferment and rebellion against his own and his son's authority. Unable to restore order, Columbus wrote to Spain asking for the assistance of a lettered official. This was probably the pretext which the Spanish government had been looking for, and they dispatched a nobleman, Francisco de Bobadilla, with judicial powers both to deal with the rebels and to investigate the grievances which they had laid against Columbus and his son. Columbus did nothing to help his own case by the arrogant fashion in which he received Bobadilla, and quickly found himself imprisoned and charged with concealing the gold of the island and wishing to make himself and other accomplices lords of the island and give it away to the Genoese. In fact, Modern scholars incline to the view that Columbus was to some degree being used as a convenient scapegoat for the wider failings of Spanish colonial policy. But this did not prevent his being sent back to Spain in chains and in disgrace. The extent of Columbus's downfall has sometimes been exaggerated. Disgrace and imprisonment were an occupational hazard for the great in his day. And Ferdinand and Isabella retained sufficient gratitude for his past exploits to allow him to retain his title of Admiral of the Ocean, and at least some of the privileges which had been granted to him. But Columbus was stripped of all of his powers in the colonies. Eventually, in March 1502, he was given permission to undertake another voyage of exploration, on condition that he did not set foot on Hispaniola. So far as he made them clear, Columbus's aims in his final voyage were to explore further to the north of the other world, which he had discovered. He may have believed that he would find a strait leading at last to the long-sought route to Asia. But it is equally likely that he was just as much motivated by a lust for gold, which had now become a mania, a desire, as Columbus himself wrote, for gold without limit. Ironically, at one point during this last voyage, Columbus was to reach the Isthmus of Panama, only about a dozen miles from the site of the great Pacific Ocean, whose existence Columbus never suspected. But apart from this, the voyage was a sorry tale of ever-increasing cruelty to those men and beasts that he encountered, sickness, storms, and frustration. After being shipwrecked for a year in Jamaica, Columbus came back to Spain for the last time, in November 1504. Here, whatever dwindling hopes of a return to favor which Columbus still had, received a fatal blow with the news of the death of Queen Isabella. It had been she who had been his chief champion. An increasingly embittered man, Columbus vainly reminded the Spanish court that "Our Redeemer ordained my path thither. There in the Indies I have brought more lands under his dominion than there are in Africa or Europe, and more than 1,700 islands apart from Hispaniola, which comprises more than the whole of Spain." It was an exaggerated plea, born of frustration and increasing instability, and met with no response. Though far from living in the poverty of popular legend, Columbus spent his final years in fruitless pursuit of the awards and privileges which he claimed were rightfully his.
Well, history has been very ambivalent about Columbus for two reasons, I think. One is obviously connected with the fact that the discovery of Central and South America caused havoc on the native populations of those lands, the islands of the Caribbean and Central America. Columbus was as far as we know, the first European to make contact with the American continent in the 15th century. If he hadn't done it, someone else would have done fairly soon. Europe was on the brink of that discovery. Columbus just happened to be the man who was in the right place at the right time.
Whether or not Columbus was the very first European to set foot on American soil, he is the first person to have explored the New World systematically and who kept records and who was able to repeat his voyages and tell other people about his voyages. So to that extent, whether or not he was the first there, he was certainly the first to bring to the attention of the Old World the existence of the New World, and that was absolutely crucial.
On May 20th, 1506, his passing unmarked by the wider world, Christopher Columbus died. It was a lonely fate for the Genoese sailor, who, for good or ill, had brought medieval